Let's continue. So I'm just going to, we're talking in the section who, where, when, and how. So the provenance, where did it come from? And Franz says, I'm happy to accept the general consensus that it was somewhere in Syria or Palestine. The latter being generally assumed in patristic accounts, but I'm less convinced by the confident assertion of some that the specific location was Antioch. His own understanding of the situation of Matthew and his community locates the gospel in a period of uncomfortable tension, which may have been experienced at any point during the middle and latter parts of the first century, depending on the way relation with the synagogue had developed in their particular community. Some sort of have this thinking that a particular point in time after Christ's ascension into heaven, that all Christians were just kicked out of the synagogue, and this kind of happened in some kind of universality. It didn't. It would depend on different communities, the relationship between the local community and the local synagogue, the Christian community, and some would be more tolerant of each other and others less so. And so what is reflected in the gospel is a certain tension, that's clear, but it's not, don't let it make you think that it's somehow a universal experience in exactly the same way, exactly the same time. The dating of the gospel. A pre-70 AD for Matthew remains a minority view, but one which has been strongly supported and which is usually dismissed not so much by specific arguments as on the basis of a preferred overall dating scheme. In the commentary that follows this is Franz, I shall favour the possibility that the gospel was, as Irenaeus declared, written in the 60s while the temple was still standing. No explanation about dating is ever fully satisfying. However, you're always looking, and scholars are always looking for what makes the most sense. If there are references in the gospel that talk about the temple that's still standing, then it makes sense that it was written before 70 AD. To assume it was written after, then you're going to be left to explain those references to a temple that's still standing in some kind of other way, which is going to be even more confusing than for later generations of Christians who are looking, but hang on, did they not hear the news? The temple had been destroyed. Why is he writing as if it's still existing? What's the joke here? Is this a humorous tactic or something? So it just makes more sense to assume that it was written then. With Mark probably written just a few years before. Relationship to Mark and to Luke. Relationship to the gospel. I am unable to explain how the Gospel of Mark could be written by someone who had the much fuller Gospel of Matthew in front of him. Matthew's 28 chapters, Mark is 16. If Matthew was written before and Mark is looking at, I've got a 28 chapter version and I'm only going to write a 16 chapter version, it just makes the mind boggle a bit, He would have had to omit the whole Sermon on the Mount, and yet chapters 5, 6, and 7, and yet find space for considerable and rather inconsequential expansion of the narrative detail in many of the stories of Jesus' ministry. Franz inclines to the view promoted by E.P. Sanders and developed by J.A.T. Robinson, that neat theories of literary dependence are unlikely to do justice to the very data of the synoptic texts, and that we should think rather of a more fluid process of mutual influence between the various centers of Christian gospel writing as people traveled around the empire and visited and consulted with one another. In such a scenario, the synoptic gospels may better be seen as at least partially parallel developments of the common traditions, rather than placed in a simple timeline of dependence. Within such a flexible process, I would regard Mark, he says, as the earliest of the surviving compilations, but this does not necessarily mean that at every point Mark's version of a saying or event must be the original from which the others are deviations. the most obvious point on which Mark has provided a formative influence is in the overall narrative structure of his gospel, which is taken up and expanded by Matthew and Luke. So Mark's idea starts in Galilee, eventually Jesus works his way to Jerusalem and Judea, and then he promises them that he's going to see them there. Matthew takes up the same idea, but then goes back to Galilee, where the triumphal sending off happens, the commission, the Great Commission, and then Luke does it in an even the expanded journey, as I mentioned earlier, from chapter 9:51 to 19. Forgot the verse there. Major themes in Matthew. So this is the biblical theology still. Jesus as a teacher. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 themes. Jesus as a teacher. Matthew portrays Jesus in a variety of ways that neither he nor his audience would have regarded as mutually exclusive. First, he portrays Jesus as a teacher. For example, in the Sermon on the Mount, others, including Jesus' enemies, also recognized that he filled this role, inadequate as it was to describe him fully. The available evidence clearly indicates, and few would dispute, that Matthew is historically correct. Jesus was a teacher. Jesus as a prophet. Second, and closely connected with Jesus' teaching role, Matthew presents Jesus as a prophet like Jeremiah, and especially a prophet healer like Elijah and Elisha. Those who insist that because Jesus was a sage, he was not a prophet, assume exclusive modern categories that would not have held among Jesus' contemporaries. Jesus as Messiah King. More important than his portrayals of Jesus as a teacher and prophet, Matthew hails Jesus as the true King of Israel, that is, the Messiah. Jesus' teachings have such special authority for Matthew's Jewish Christian audience, precisely because he is God's appointed king. Later Christians and Jews outside Palestine were far less interested in a Messiah than the Gospels were, which indicates how unlikely it would have been for the Gospel writers simply to have invented the tradition of Jesus' Messiahship. Just an interesting little point, that the whole looking for the Messiah by the first or the second century was a different ballgame. Now, the Son of God. Matthew also frequently employs the expression Son of God, which he regards as virtually interchangeable with Christ. Further, in extant gospel tradition, Jesus is not merely a Son of God, but the Son of God, his beloved and unique Son. Son of Man. Son of Man represents another important Christological term for Matthew. Although he borrows it from sources like Mark, who develops an eschatological Christology related to the Son of Man in Daniel 7, because Son of Man can mean a human being, some scholars reject its eschatological sense in the Gospels. Most, however, recognize that at least some of the Son of Man sayings use the title eschatologically, whether they derive the title's background from Daniel or, less likely, from the uncertainly dated similitudes of one Enoch. When the Pharisees think that Jesus blasphemes because he forgives sins, Jesus demonstrates the Son of Man's authority on earth. ... He likewise claims authority for the Son of Man as Lord of the Sabbath. You don't claim such authority if this Son of Man isn't something more than just a man. Judge, Lord, and mediator of the divine presence. In the Q traditions, Jesus portrays himself not as a mere human teacher, but as a judge in the day of judgment, who will be addressed as Lord, Lord. Even John the Baptist recognizes the coming one as greater than a merely human, natural Messiah or teacher. He presents Jesus as one whose sandals he is unworthy to unloose or carry. That is, as one whose servant he is unworthy to be. This supernatural figure would not baptize in mere water, but in the Spirit of God for the righteous and fire for the wicked. He would likewise perform the divine role of judge, separating the righteous for eternal life and the wicked for damnation. If Matthew and Luke believed Jesus to be a merely natural Messiah, they both did an inexplicably sloppy job of editing Q, because it's obviously they believed in its impact. Early Christian writers preferred to make their case through a variety of images rather than to focus on answering a small number of precise Christological questions no one was yet asking in their century. But their images from the start include a superhuman role subordinate to the authority of the Father. Later Christian vocabulary has tended to follow the language of the creeds, but the Gospel writers had much more creative liberty and drew from a vast reservoir of biblical images for God and God's agents in history. The Kingdom of Heaven. With but 4 exceptions, Matthew employs the phrase Kingdom of Heaven rather than the phrase Kingdom of God, found elsewhere in the New Testament, including all other material from the Gospel tradition. Matthew, preferring a usage that would communicate better in the Pharisaic-type circles he was engaging, naturally preferred this synonymous expression. But virtually every stratum of Gospel tradition testifies that Jesus regularly announced the kingdom. There should be no doubt that this was a characteristic emphasis of Jesus' teaching. Scholars have sometimes debated whether Jesus emphasized a present or a future kingdom, however. More clear evidence seems to favor Jesus announcing a future impending kingdom. Yet many have noted an emphasis on the presence of the kingdom in the Gospels, especially in the kingdom parables and sayings like the one about entering the kingdom as a child. Early Christians, most notably in the Pauline circle, continued the present and future tension in eschatology required by a Messiah who had not yet visibly completed Israel's eschatological hopes. As Jesus' resurrection is the first installment on the future resurrection of the righteous, guaranteeing that it will occur, so Jesus' demonstrations of God's rule at his first coming foreshadow the completed revelation of his rule when he returns. In the interim, according to the distinctive perspective probably shared by most early Christians, believers enjoy the Spirit as the down payment of their future hope. Romans 8:23. Any questions? Great. You ready for doing some exegesis?
I just had one short question.
Yes.
Years ago I read a book by Trey Montano called The Hebrew Christ. And among many things, he's arguing for the gospel text written much earlier than we often thought. But one of the points he makes is that the structure of the Greek betrays the structure of Hebrew idiom. And it gives you this sense of, in the tradition that Matthew's gospel was originally written in Hebrew. Have you come across anything like that?
Yeah, in fact in the break someone was asking about, what's the theory about the first gospel, Matthew, in fact being written in the Aramaic. And the version, but it was lost, and the version we have in the Greek is substantially the same. In fact, Keenan would argue that it's, from the Aramaic, the formulation of words and phrases, it isn't how you would bring it in the Greek. So, and it was only mentioned ever once, according to Allison and Davies in their big three-volume commentary. That, however, doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of Semitic expressions in there. And that is absolutely clear. Not only, it's all the way through. Matthew is a thoroughgoing Jew. And, like a lot of the early Christians, they just saw themselves, well, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I'm a faithful Jew.
Right.
So it wasn't this, that happened obviously sometime down the track, but there are lots of expressions in there. And sometimes, like Golgotha comes from a Hebrew word gulgolet, skull. So they're grey-sized or something, Greekized or Hebrew words, but yeah. So no worries.
If you're translating from, say, a Hebrew and an Aramaic speaker, you're translating into Greek, well, the Greek verb's all about tense. There's no tense in the Hebrew verb. It's all about all the different parts of it, other human experiences. That's a rough thing.
There are tenses
And I've
in Hebrew.
wondered why there's so much aorist in the...
The Greek is aorist rich.
Yeah, terribly rich. But I often wonder whether it isn't because the Hebrew is about, this is another rough one, it's finished, or it's not finished, not complete.
The Hebrew, it's basically present and past or
so
future.
The aorist is well, that's not their attempt, because they're thinking in one, basically.
There's a very complex, Greek is far more technical. You can write a lot more things in Greek with precision than in Hebrew. And so that's one of the problems, in fact, when you're actually translating Hebrew, you're constantly asking yourself, is it saying this? Is it a genitive, or could it be this? So Bethel is city of God. And just put the two words together. Bethlehem, house of God, not city of God. Bethlehem is house of bread. But then you can have other structures, whereas in the Greek you've got so many more things to play with. And the participles, you've got about 6 different participles. So it's just a richer language to express things. And in the Hebrew, a lot of the, when they put repetition in the Hebrew, they wanted to repeat. Whereas in English, we tend not to want to use the same word twice in the one sentence for elegance. They wanted the same word for compounding effect. That's how they went. Any other questions? Great, well let's excuse that talk. Yeah.
About the reference of the sandals there, I'm worthy of being a servant, you translated. When John the Baptist said,
Yes.
Jesus, I'm unworthy of. There is a different interpretation, goes back to the lecture that Levi wrote, I don't know if you read about it. The brother-in-law who had the right to get married to a widow without a childless widow.
Yes.
There was a particular right involved in sandals. Some scholars give that interpretation. Jesus has the right, not him.
For doing what, sorry?
For getting married to these childless widows, the people of God, so to say. There was...
I hadn't come across that, but I guess it would go against so much of, what we do know, that he didn't marry and he was
obviously, metaphorically, not certainly physically, biologically.
Sure. And who knows, maybe in another sense, some of his siblings, not siblings, his relatives, there could have been something like that. I'm not sure. I'd have to be much more au fait with rabbinic law,
The scholar in my diocese priest. Anyway,
good, thank you. Good, well we'll wrap that up and let's get the exegesis out and we'll start doing some work there.